Good morning to everyone. Actually, my presentation would be a bit different from the previous ones because it will be more empirical. So there will be even some numbers and statistics on the slides. But basically, I'm going to talk about the state-democracy nexus in the post-communist world. What is my main message? So let's make it clear. The title of the conference was The State as a Gold Monster, and I argue that that gold monster, I mean the state capacity, has played rather a very positive role in strengthening democracy in the post-communist world. No state, no democracy. So this seems to be a rule, at least for the post-communist countries. However, it was very much true for the first period of the post-communist transition until 2010 or so. Currently, this nexus, I mean that you have a high state capacity and then you have also a quite consolidated democracy. This relationship or correlation has broken down. And actually we see that the high state capacity has not prevented the democracies from backsliding. I mean, if you take Hungary and Poland. And to some extent, I tried to explain it as well. So if we are talking about the state-democracy nexus, what is that? It's primarily the question about the sequencing. Whether the state formation happens first and then democracy comes next, or first you have democratization and then the strong state appears, or those two processes happen at the very same time simultaneously. And the state capacity is actually one of the key concepts in my presentation. So if you talk about state capacity, here I talk mostly about administrative capacity, the capacity of the bureaucracy to construct and implement policies regarding public services and regulations throughout the territory of a nation state. So we are actually talking about provision of public goods. So for me, this is the major definition of state capacity. Whether state is able to deliver the public goods or not. So I'm going to talk about the state capacity in the post-communist world and how it's connected or correlated with democracy or the quality of democracy. How can democracy enhance a state capacity? Here I have brought two different models. One model is the electoral mechanism, in which you have democracy, electoral competition, and just the public, I mean the general public, the people, demand for well-functioning state. And this is the major incentive why the elites in power are forced to increase the state capacity because they want to get re-elected. They are forced to increase state capacity for that because the public, they're voters are demanding for that. And another mechanism is based on the free media, on the monitoring institutions. They are also monitoring the incumbent government, and this also forces the elites to increase the state capacity, to increase transparency, reduce corruption, and so on. So democracy is rather good for state capacity. And on other way around as well, I mean, an effective state also allows democracy to flourish because it provides the major institutions for democracy, the rule of law, protection of human rights and citizens' rights, and so on. So both are needed, democracy and the state. So if there is no state, there is no democracy, and vice versa. Francis Fukuyama, a very well-known author, has talked about the major pillars of modern political order, and he argues that the modern political order, in a very general sense, has three major pillars: strong and modern state, the rule of law, and accountable government. And if you're looking at different models, actually I brought here 3-4 different models. Then the Western European model has been that the rule of law already appeared in the Middle Ages. This came first. Then the strong, capable state appeared, and then, in the end, democracy happened. If you take the American model, then it's a bit different, the rule of law, then democracy, and after that, the strong, capable state appeared. And the Chinese model is very different. First, there was a strong state, and because the state was such a powerful actor, democracy and the rule of law never appeared. But what about the post-communist world? How it's different? So I argue that in many countries, especially in Central Eastern Europe, they had some experiences with the rule of law before communism. But democratization and the state-making happened simultaneously at the very same time. And this makes the post-communist transition very different and very special, because all those major processes, democratization and state formation, actually happened at the very same time. And it also made it quite challenging. Anna Krzymala-Pusse, a Polish political scientist, has studied some of the peculiarities of the post-communist state building in her book, Rebuilding Leviathan. And she argues that actually the state building in the post-communist world was rather a messy affair. The outcome was never predetermined, and it was rather as a result of the inter-elite competition in which every party wanted to bend the rules in their favor if they were allowed to do so. She also maps three major features for the post-communist state building. First, it was a very rapid process. There were no ready-made blueprints how to build post-communist states. And this is the reason why the historical legacies were played such an important role. Whether you had the Leninist legacies in hand or some Western legacies were present. It was very much dominated by informal rules and institutions. And if informal rules and institutions, oligarchs, clientelism, patronage, and so on, prevailed, usually democracy and high state capacity did not appear. And finally, of course, we have to take into account the international context. The state building in post-communist Europe was very much influenced by the EU conditionality, and so on. So it was a very complicated and a very special process. And what was the result of that process? Here, actually, it's quite astonishing that there is a very strong correlation between the state capacity and democratization in the post-communist world. Here you have some countries, this data is from 2006. Here we have a cluster of the states which had a quite high state capacity, and those countries were also democratic. Here we have Hungary, Estonia, the Czech Republic, Poland, and so on. Then we have some hybrid regimes or authoritarian regimes which had a medium level state capacity, for example, Russia, Armenia, Belarus, and so on. And the Central Asian countries mostly had quite a low state capacity. But still, you can see a very clear correlation between democratization or the quality of democracy and the level of state capacity. And there are different ways how to measure state capacity. Here you can see one definition which was used for the previous analysis. But now the question could be raised, why we see that kind of correlation? Well, it's in that way that those countries which are also democracies have a high state capacity. So scholars actually argue that the initial conditions and the early years of the post-communist transition were playing very important role. So if the state capacity was underdeveloped at the onset of independence in the early 90s, democracy was an unlikely outcome, and vice versa. If the state capacity was high, then those countries usually became consolidated democracies. And why so? So first, this scenario, weak state, no democracy. For example, it's applicable to the Central Asian countries and to Russia and so on. If the state structures were very weak and bureaucracy quite inefficient and corrupt, and the society also was quite weakly organized, and there was also no viable opposition or balanced party competition, the elites started to enhance their power, and quite quickly especially to very powerful presidents like Putin later and Yeltsin and so on, they quite quickly pushed aside both the rule of law and checks and balances. And those countries rather became or ended up as autocracies. And because corruption, clientelism, rent-seeking, and so on, that was rampant, also the state capacity never increased. So here we have some examples: Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. But there was also another scenario in which you had a considerable state capacity already in the beginning of the post-communist transition. And then the outcome was a consolidated democracy. So it's the opposite scenario. The state capacity was developed enough even before the independence. Society was also quite organized. There was a balanced competition between different political parties. There was a viable opposition. And so the rulers or the ruling elites were more compelled to deliver public services to their voters because they already had this state apparatus for delivering public services, and they also wanted to get re-elected. And so it also further compelled them to enhance state capacity because they wanted to get re-elected, and so it was a logical thing to do. To increase the state capacity. And also because there was a viable opposition, the incumbent elites in power, their power ambitions also got checked by various monitoring and oversight institutions, and the opposition also demanded accountable government and fair rules. And here we have some examples of that, a more positive scenario. For example, Estonia, the Czech Republic, Poland, Slovenia, and so on. So we have two very different scenarios in which state capacity and democracy are intertwined. So two basic models: a weak state capacity in the early years of post-communist transition, and then consolidated democracy was rather unlikely outcome, and a strong capacity already in the early 90s, and then usually two countries became democratic, became consolidated democracies in the post-communist world. And it's quite interesting to see that state capacity and also the institutional architecture of the post-communist countries are highly correlated with each other. So those countries which had a weak state capacity already in the 90s rather adopted strong presidential systems, or they adopted presidential systems, strong presidential powers. And those countries which had strong state capacity rather introduced the parliamentary system with a weak presidency. This seems to be also a rule. So why in that way, if, for example, if you take those countries which introduced strong presidency, in that case, there were less capable and resourceful political administrative actors to oppose the power concentration in the hands of presidents. So the presidents more or less had the free hands. And because those countries, those states, were also quite weak, they were very prone to various crises, ethnic conflicts, economic crises, and so on. And then there was very clear public demand for strong leadership. Take Russia, for example, in the 1990s. So those countries ended up with strong presidency and authoritarian rule. So it seems to be also a very clear pattern. And here you can see the figure about this, in which here we have countries which rather adopted parliamentary system or which did not have strong, powerful presidents. Those countries more likely became democratic countries, and those countries who introduced very strong presidency, very powerful presidents, those countries rather ended up as hybrid regimes or authoritarian regimes. And actually, in the long run, it became rather a self-reinforcing cycle in which if the strong power vertical introduced by the presidents was already in place, institutional or legal checks and balances never appeared, then, of course, those institutions which were developed by the autocrats were intended for rent-seeking, strengthening patronage networks, and so on. And of course, later, those powerful incumbents, presidents, were not very interested in promoting those institutions which were intended for enhancing transparency, to fight corruption, and so on, because those institutions were actually threatening their power monopoly. And this is the reason why there are no authoritarian regimes in the post-communist world which have a very strong state capacity. Strong state capacity, advanced state capacity is rather reserved for democracies in the post-communist world. But if you are looking at the contemporary developments, then the things have changed. Here we have Viktor Orban and Jarosław Kaczynski, Poland and Hungary. And as we know, those countries have experienced democratic backsliding. Here you can see the Freedom House scores for Hungary and Poland. No comments on this. I guess we all know this story, what has happened. And as you remember, those countries were actually one of the countries which had one of the strongest, one of the most advanced state capacity in the post-communist world, at least in the mid-2000s. So it seems to be that the state capacity is not serving anymore as a bulwark against democratic backsliding. There are two authors, Stephen Haggard and Robert Kaufman, who have studied this process, democratic backsliding. They have even proposed a model for that. First, you have quite pronounced polarization. Then one of the major parties became a populist, illiberal, anti-system party. This party seizes the executive, so it becomes a party of the government. Then it also gets the control over parliament, and then it starts to dismantle all those checks and balances. This has actually, if you are looking at this figure here, this has actually happened in Hungary, and to some extent to Poland as well. Of course, there are some alternative scenarios as well, as you can see on the figure, but this is the basic process for democratic backsliding in the post-communist world. And so the question could be raised, why it has happened, what is going on. Of course, if you were looking at that figure, it comes out that democratic backsliding is not so much related or connected with the state power or with the state. It's more associated with political parties, political contestation, political competition, polarization, the collapse of center parties, imbalances in the party system, and so on. Those things are playing role, not the state capacity itself. And but however, if you think about this, about state capacity, still we can imagine two different scenarios if we take state capacity into account. One scenario, what has happened in Hungary, the state administration and all different political actors, somehow dependent on the state, have rather adopted that anti-European illiberal ideology introduced by Fidesz, and they have became quite clear allies with the ruling party. And another scenario is Poland, in which it seems to be that the state administrators or state administration has resisted the ruling party. However, if we will see the process in which the checks and balances get eroded, then again, also for Hungary and Poland, probably in the longer run, the state capacity is going to diminish because there are no anymore the checks and balances which somehow could enhance state capacity. But at the same time, it's a very alarming trend because we can see that the state capacity is not anymore, is not acting as a major guarantee against democratic backsliding in the post-communist world. So, in conclusion, yes, we can say that this gold monster, the state, has played rather an overly positive role in the post-communist transition. So weak state capacity, no democracy, no democratization, and advanced state capacity, and the outcome would be democratic consolidation. This seems to be a rule. But this logical pattern has broken down, as we can see if we consider the cases of Hungary and Poland. And it's a very alarming trend. We don't know why it has happened. We still have to figure it out, how the state capacity and democratic backsliding could be connected with each other, and when the states and the ways how the states are functioning in Hungary and Poland have also, this has also contributed to the democratic breakdown to some extent. So we don't know how democratic backsliding and state capacity are connected. But still, if we consider the contemporary situation, then if it's in that way, that if the new democracies with relatively well-functioning state apparatus just revert back to authoritarianism, what would be the future for democracy worldwide if those countries which used to have very high state capacity, which were functioning, which had functioning states, and those countries revert back to authoritarianism? Then I think that the future of democracy would be also quite bleak, at least in the post-communist world. Thank you very much.